Welcome to the latest installment of Defense Disrupted. My name is Ian Kalin. I'm the CEO, co-founder of Turbine One. We are welcome today with an upgrade from your hosting experience. Rather than it just being me to be your host, I am proud to welcome Ed Padinsky, prior guest, currently the Chief Mission and Operations Officer for Turbine One. We're getting an upgrade, Ed. We're bringing you on to outnumber our guests. So, Ed, welcome. How are you feeling about being a co-host today?
Fantastic. I'm excited about this one, Ian, and especially given that our guest today. I've gotten to know him over the last year or so.
Brilliant. Well, let's talk about this guest. So, Rear Admiral retired Fred Pyle. He has asked us to call him Fred for this podcast. I'm going to ask Fred a couple of introductory fast-fire questions, but I'm going to first set the stage for a little bit of his biography, but we'll ask some questions to go deeper into it. He is a native of Pennsylvania and a graduate of Penn State University. So for this podcast, I'm wearing a appropriate shirt for the great oldest brewery in America, a Pennsylvania icon. I won't give it an actual name other than the logo because I don't want to accidentally invoke some sort of trademark or endorsement. I'm just to say that the heart of Pennsylvania is well represented on this podcast. That's the purpose of that introduction. So Fred, we're honored to have you here. You've served in the Navy for over 40 years. I'm going to ask you 4 quick questions as an unfair brevity, a degree of introduction to expose a little bit about the extraordinary service you had over those 40 plus years. I'm going to ask these questions up front, and then we'll see how much we can power through them. What was your best job in the Navy, worst job in the Navy, first job in the Navy, and last job in the Navy? It'd be pretty funny if they were all the same thing, but let's see. Maybe we'll start with the first job. What was your first job in the Navy, sir?
Sure. Well, first, Ian, thank you to you and Ed for this opportunity. It's great to be on. First job in the Navy was an aviation fire controlman. So I was enlisted. I joined when I was 17. I was stationed at then Naval Air Station Miramar when I was still a naval base. And I maintained F-14 Tomcats. So that was my first job. Great job. I learned about electronics. I learned about weapon systems. I learned about carrier strike groups. I'll go to best job in the Navy next, commanding the Winston S. Churchill. A guided missile destroyer, DDG-81. And there's just something special about O5 Command. It's about 320 sailors. Our DDGs are like the Porsches of the sea. I mean, they are just great ships to drive and to operate. And you just develop a real camaraderie with your crew when you have a size of crew like that. Worst job in the Navy, I could joke and say every job in the Pentagon. I did it 4 times. But I would encourage anyone to do a tour in DC and do time in the Pentagon. I served as a programming budgeting officer, and those are hard jobs, but Admiral Mike Mullen said, you will make more of a difference in the Pentagon than you ever will in the fleet. And my first job was in our Navy budget office, and at first I thought, that's just propaganda. But I eventually realized that Admiral Mullen was spot on, and that you can make a difference by working in DC. And then please remind me the
last one. What were those final years of service?
So last job was, I was director of surface warfare. So I worked on the Navy staff, and I oversaw the surface fleet and the combat systems that go on our surface combatants, our aircraft carriers, and our amphibious ships. And that was an extremely rewarding job. And I had an opportunity to make a difference in the fleet, both from a training standpoint and a capability standpoint. So that's the four categories of jobs.
Four corners. And of course, we're just skimming the surface, but thankfully we have an opportunity to go a little bit deeper into some of the lessons from those years and hopefully a chance to reflect on what it means for us today. Ed, do you want to upgrade on my set of questions and have more thoughtful, developed insights into this extraordinary service?
Yeah, absolutely. Then Admiral, I'm going to call you Admiral, even though you told me to call you Fred. It's just the way we're raised. I was going to ask you, like, having that sort of view shed over time from being on surface combatants to commanding them to basically programming and writing requirements and making sure all those things were built out. What are the sort of the biggest changes that you saw either happening and you were happy about it or maybe not happy about it? What are the ones that maybe even better that you drove, that you really believed in? A lot of these things obviously take time. What are those kind of stories that you have from, especially given that spectrum of having been in the fleet all the way into the N9 staff at the Pentagon?
Yeah, and so I would say the main system or the capability that I saw was the most influential was the Aegis weapon system. So for our guests, that's the combat systems that makes up our surface combatants. And that system was developed in the 80s and introduced as our first Aegis cruisers and destroyers came into the fleet. And it still exists today. And, an Aegis destroyer is built to last 35 years. And we have the ability to, through modernization and upgrades, to continue to modernize that Aegis weapon system. And I'll give you Exhibit A of how that system is doing. If you look at what's going on in the Red Sea and what has been going on since the 19th of October, 2023, where nearly 30 ships have been engaged in actual combat, and that system, and more importantly, our crews have been performing as designed, as trained, and it's been very effective.
Well, but if I can interject on that line of questioning there, Ed, I very much agree. I very much agree with the assessment of the Aegis weapon system as a platform. But to expand on that capability set a little bit, and especially given your expertise leading the budgets of many things to increase national security, there's an aspect of that Red Sea story that I recently wouldn't say is so efficient. Broadly speaking, to paraphrase a complex set of recent and rather tragic events, there is a situation where Navy ships are firing very expensive missiles and very cheap drones. We may be finding those drones with the Aegis weapon system, but I think there's a larger question of the efficiency of the David and the Goliath in that dynamic. A lot to unpack there, but can I ask you to expand a little bit on your perspectives of that dynamic?
No, Ian, you're spot on. And in my last job, I was challenged with that exact issue. We're on the wrong side of the cost curve. We need to find a more efficient, effective way to take out these low-cost drones. That work was in progress during my watch, and it continues to be in progress. What we were very focused on is not conveying that problem set or that issue down to our commanders. We didn't want them worrying about cost efficiency. We wanted them worrying about defense in depth, protecting their own ship and protecting the defended asset, whether it's a commercial vessel or the aircraft carrier. So there's definitely the tactical side of things is things are working exactly where they're designed. There's the business problem. We have to find a better solution here. And I'll add to that what the Red Sea unpacked for us, what Ukraine unpacked for us is we've become a service that was used to minimum sustaining rates. What do I mean by that? What does it take if you take the Standard Missile 2 built by Raytheon, for example, what is the minimum sustaining rate to keep that thing alive? Given our current engagements, our current conflicts, we're starting to think about maximum sustaining rate, increasing our weapons inventory. That's no small task because the industrial base, I would just say, isn't where it needs to be. And that's work that we have to complete. But two parts. One, we're getting after less costly capability that can defeat that unmanned threat. And then longer term, we're building our industrial base to make sure we have the proper inventories.
I mean, there's so many elements of this that I think are fun to unpack and from an intellectual perspective, but incredibly challenging to actually deploy. I completely agree with you with the core perspective of the frontline warfighter, that commander. You shouldn't have to worry about how much a defensive missile costs at the point that you're launching it. You're launching it to save lives.
Mm-hmm.
Period. End of story. Understood. And now that we have seen enough of those activities as a nation, publicly discussed and openly, reported upon, I think there at some point, after you put out the fire of the house that's burning down, you come back and say, how should we rebuild this house better so that it doesn't keep catching fire over and over again? What are your perspectives on how well those lessons learned are actually being employed? With no criticism, perhaps, or of any of the current administration, but more of a systemic question. Are the systems in place to respond to these urgent changes, and are people learning those lessons?
So I'll give you two quick examples. First, we need a parallel budgeting process, parallel to the planning, programming, budgeting, execution process. Minimum timeline, 2 years to you deliver a capability of the fleet, whether that's a DIU, a replicator, or the Navy's contribution to that disruptive capabilities office. That must happen. It must continue to happen. And we need to build that so it's incorporated permanently into all of our services. The second example I'll give of what right looks like is before October 19th of 2023, we were engaged in a hot war in the Red Sea. If an engagement happened, there were times when we would need to use the sneaker net, actually walk off the data, bring it back to the States, analyze it, 3-4 weeks, a month later, you get the results. That dog doesn't hunt in today's warfighting environment. We now have the capability to make sure we can download that, analyze it ashore, provide feedback within 24 hours. That is game changing. That's what learning looks like, and adapting. It's incredibly important that we have that capability to immediately provide feedback to the leadership that's forward of, hey, your last engagement was spot on. Techniques, procedures are good, or, hey, we need to talk and make some adjustments here because that wasn't your best day.
Yeah. And I can't help but say, and really, I'm just so excited to be having this conversation. I want to have one final question. Then I'm going to pivot back over to Ed to ask more informed levels of questions on the aspects of this really challenging dynamic that we're talking about. But even in your scenario, sir, of the 24 hours, I think I know one company that can do that in 24 minutes. May or may not be logoed on Ed's head, but I won't give any specific product endorsements in that regard. And ask the question, but fundamentally, if something used to take months to get me done in days, and days becomes hours, when does the change in speed become a change in kind? If I can do it that much faster, what does that introduce in terms of echelons of decision making, expectations on performance, weapons release authority? There's a lot of those fundamental dynamics. When you change the game that much, does that fundamentally strain the systems that were put in place perhaps for a different fight? And I sincerely don't know the answer to that question, but I think that's what I'm witnessing in conversations like these, is that the demonstrated art of the possible, what was recently demonstrated, I would say broadly, without time marking this podcast too much, of the one example of what Ukraine did to Russia most recently. At what point is like, okay, some things are fundamentally changing. Your drones are not new, but hey, now something is a little different here in terms of the impact of what can be done at an asymmetric level of damage. And so I think that's where I have ongoing curiosity. But like most of my questions in national security, while I have a very personal passion and interest, I don't have the experience. Ed does. Ed, why am I dominating as a host here? Ed, you should be interrupting me and asking more questions about this. What do you think about, how to explore this conversation? And how else can we, pull from Fred's extraordinary experience to expose the opportunity?
Like one thing that I was thinking about, talking to Admiral Pyle a few weeks ago in DC, and then a little bit since, and obviously in the run up to this conversation, is about how the Navy sort of does things differently than the joint world. And I mean that as both a compliment and sometimes it does things differently, obviously in combat in the Red Sea, prepared for combat in a lot of other places. But how we think about mission command and control differs a bit from other services. I want to hear, sort of Admiral Pyle's perspective on how technology can impact that better. It's like one example, having deployed with a lot of special operations forces in the Central Command Theater, we dominated, the electromagnetic spectrum. We dominated communications. I never had like 6 layers of redundant communications. That doesn't happen on destroyers, as Admiral Pyle knows probably better than anybody else. It doesn't happen on islands in the Pacific. And we've become heavily reliant on cloud, and gambling that cloud will be there, and unobstructed communications. I think the reality is, even in peacetime, even when an adversary isn't involved, comms aren't that great. How do you see technology playing out in the mission command construct? And one of my favorite things, even at this company with Ian, he sort of leads command by negation. I tell them what we're going to do, and unless you tell me in the next 2 minutes not to do it, I'm executing. I just love that perspective. But from a technology perspective, as Ian's kind of describing, being able to do things without sending things back, to improve things without sending things back. Do you think there's a there for the Navy for that type of approach? Or do you think the Navy's going to have to be, I'd say, more joint, more cloud reliant?
Yeah, so it's a great point. And from a history or historical standpoint, spot on. We, as sailors, especially as commanding officers, love to take in all lines, head to sea, and go execute our mission. And if we don't hear from upper echelon for a while, even better, right? We're out there doing our job, we're getting it done, leave me alone, I can get the mission done. That said, we have to fight as a joint force. We need support from Spacecom, we need support from Cybercom, we need support from our Air Force, Marine Corps, all of our Army counterparts, because they bring capability. They bring fires, that are not organic to a carrier strike group. They bring, as you talked about, our ability to move, shoot, and communicate, and the communicate piece is critical. We're gonna have to have a primary, a secondary, a tertiary way to communicate, given some of the adversaries we're going up against, because we know it's going to be a contested communications environment. So, to your point, yes, we have to continue to improve as a joint force. We recognize that in our certifications as we work up to deploy a carrier strike group or an amphibious ready group with a Marine Expeditionary Unit on it. We make that event as joint as possible, so we have that experience before we head over into theater and actually start operating. Good question.
It's fun from my perspective, to be working and have so many great partners in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and to see the cultural differences between them. Just to echo a point that you made, Fred, the submarine community, the Navy community, for perhaps historic reasons, are used to just being out and being the commander of that ship and not really relying upon comms like 200 years ago. Our Army, Air Force, they're like, wait, the phones always work. What are you talking about? Why would you ever? Of course, I have to go up the chain to the senior commander. I just saw them this morning. Like, it's this kind of this cultural expectation that, and maybe it's actually even well aligned perhaps with the fact that great power competition, Indo-PACOM, may or may not have always been led by the Navy. You end up seeing this kind of bizarre overlap of comms. Why would we think comms are going to be there? We actually act, from a Navy cultural perspective and on the tyranny of distance combined with the nature of modern threats. It kind of all aligns up with, we're not expecting the phones to work, y'all. So how the hell are we going to be able to execute this mission with joint command and control, and an expectation that the network itself is part of the battlefield? I guess from my perspective, that point of reflection is I think the Navy gets that really well from my perspective because of the history and culture that it seems to have inherited. Is that a fair statement? Am I off base on that?
No, Ian, it's very fair. And I think as Ed touched on, and you mentioned mission command, the fact that that's ingrained in our DNA from day one, and it's been in the Navy since, 250 years ago, that's a good leadership trait, a good character trait to have in the environment we're going into. So when you may be in the fog of war, when comms may not be perfect, you still have the initiative, and it's just instinct to act and execute your mission. I think that's very positive, and it's the right way to train, because in the absence of information, you're going to execute.
Okay, so that's the history. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the history, how we got to this dynamic. Let's talk a little bit about the present, and then we'll leave some time to talk about the future. So there's a lot of present conversation about government efficiency, which I think by all measures, wherever you feel personally, that's generally a good thing. You want taxpayer dollars to be spent well. You want to have efficiency and resourcefulness in the battlefield. The old phrase, supply chains wins wars. So that's that recognizing that that's the environment. What's your sense of how new this focus on government efficiency is today? So to ask in another way, is this really a change in Department of Defense experience, cultural recognition of the efficiency of dollars spent? Or frankly, part of the reason of this question, I'm a skeptic. I don't think it's that new. I think to some extent, maybe there's more press on it, maybe there's more media attention on it, but I don't believe that it's really that much of a change in the way the Department of Defense has always thought. But that's me not being an expert in that. I've never been in charge of budgeting at the Pentagon. What's your perspective on how new this dynamic is?
Ian, I'm in the same place you are. I think it's, with every administration, there are new policies that come out, and as a military that is subordinate to civilian leadership, we execute policy, we implement policy. So that's what's taking place now. Yep, there's a lot of press on it, and I'm personally a fiscal conservative, and I think we should always be efficient with every single tax dollar we get. We have been looking at drawing down both our uniform and our civilian personnel during all 4 of my tours in the Pentagon. I first served there in 2002, so I've done 23 years in the Pentagon, over 4 tours. And again, these drills that my uniformed and civilian colleagues are going through right now, they're not unique. I would argue, we have seen these drills before. The magnitude, maybe not, but yes, these efficiency drills are not uncommon.
Well, does the magnitude then change the dynamic? If it is so large, do you think that it will lead to things like our ability to, just to pick on a sore subject, just to be a little provocative, perhaps intentionally, to build ships even faster? Can we cut our way to be able to do that better?
Yeah, I hope we can, because we as a Navy have been ineffective in increasing our ship count over the 2 decades plus I served in the Pentagon. Currently, the requirement for the number of ships is 381. We're in the 290s, and we've been bouncing along between the 290 and 300 during my entire time serving in the Pentagon. So I applaud, the executive order to establish this maritime industrial base, have a maritime action plan, and bring in all the tools of national power, not just the Navy, to improve our commercial shipbuilding base and our military shipbuilding base to hopefully grow our Navy and grow our maritime capability. So I think that's goodness. I have a fair amount of skepticism because, I've worked a lot. I worked a lot on this. My beard was a different color when I started working on it. We've got to get it right because we are a maritime nation. This nation relies on open sea lines of communication, and the United States Navy is the security underwriter for those sea lines of communication. So we got to get it right.
On that note, Admiral, increasing ship capacity, seeing and from the CNO's nav plans, a lot of subordinate sort of guidance and projects underway. There's this concept of crewed-uncrewed teaming, and basically expanding out the fleet count, if you will, the whole count, if in a way that's different than we would have done 20 years ago. Do you think there's a there? Is that real? Is the surface community embracing it, or is it just pockets of USV squadrons and other things? Because what we've seen thus far, I have a handful of people, good friends that are still in the Navy. Hey, we're going to throw some capabilities out there. We're not going to think about .MLPF and all those other really important things. Through how we warfight this way, we're just going to get out there and experiment, and often things sort of become costly and fall by the wayside. Just curious, your thoughts on how those things are going, and really what the future of crewed and uncrewed teaming is.
Sure, I'm a 100% believer in crewed-uncrewed teaming, and no matter whether you're wearing the wings of an aviator, or the dolphins of a submarine officer, or the swoop pin of a surface warrior, we have to embrace it. Our aviation teammates have embraced it sooner, given unmanned aerial capability that we've used in Iraq and Afghanistan. The surface community, I think, has bought into it. We talk about a 60% manned fleet, a 40% unmanned fleet, and that is the future. Aviation talks similar. I've heard discussions of a 40% manned aviation community, 60% unmanned. This is decades into the future. So we realize that we've got to bring autonomous systems in to do the dull, the dirty, the dangerous, so you can take the sailor out of that threat environment, reduce the risk to the sailor, but more importantly, the capability that it brings, the capability gaps that it fills, that's the so what. To the skeptics, you make a good point because this is one person's opinion, Fred's opinion, but you would find those out there that may not be believers in it. I found when you're introducing a new technology, first, you have to train to it. You've got to give the appropriate training. Then you have to test. You got to have reps and sets, repetitions and sets demonstrating the capability. And that's what'll quiet the doubters. When they see that, hey, this capability really does work. You mentioned the unmanned surface divisions. We've got 3 deployed right now, and we've got a surface development squadron, which is an 06 command overseeing that. So the community has made serious investments and how we're going to deploy that unmanned capability. So I think we're committed to it as a community for the surface force. I think it's a critical capability that we have to adopt, and we will go through some learning pains, like you talked about with the whole .MLPF, and do we have it properly supported? But I think we're moving in the right direction.
I love that phrase, the dull, the dirty, the dangerous. I've never heard that before. I need to add that to my lexicon. And I'm curious about those examples of those commands leading such transformations. And I honestly don't know if, and maybe I'm embarrassed to say this, if that is considered core capability of equipping the next wave of surface fleets, or are they considered what I would characterize as innovations outside the system? So you mentioned DIU and Replicator at the beginning. Love those programs. We're very big supporters of that program. That's not your classic PEO requirements, internal system that is the backbone of military development. They're quite literally outside the system, perhaps even competitively so. there's pockets of folks within the DoD that are not big fans of replicator. So I'm thinking about your statement there of the dull, dirty, and dangerous. And thinking, well, is that being done through the DIU replicator type experiences, and they may be institutionalized revolutions, or are they actually core a man equipped to train, a set of systems already in place? How would you characterize, particularly the unmanned capabilities in the Navy? Where does that sit today?
Yeah. So, and I think it's both. It goes back to that. We need a parallel to, how we buy the big pieces of kit: aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, planes, and that is the planning, programming, budgeting, execution process. It is the system we're going to use to buy the big pieces of kit. If DIU, if replicator, if disruptive capabilities office is the system we're going to use, then I think it's a fairly effective system, because how that process works and how I've witnessed it working, and I'll use the example of the threat of unmanned air systems to our surface combatants. To your point about needing a more cost-effective means of getting after that, we said, okay, this is an issue. What existing capability is out there? We identified some existing capability that can get after that threat. And then we call them sprints. We'll get it out there in the hands of an operator, give it a quick test. And if it works, okay, let's pursue. Let's continue. Let's continue to put money into this to see if this capability could actually be fielded. That's very good behavior in my mind. And that's what we're going to need to outprocure, outpace, and maintain a positive capability gap with the adversary of our ability to do that. I believe that we need something institutionalized with Congress and a defined process that is as well understood as PPBE. That can be a misnomer. But to those that understand the budget, we need a similar process to have that rapid capability introduction into all the services. Did I answer your question?
Absolutely. You warmed my heart with just PBBE. I mean, I was excited to talk budgets. And for those that in this podcast that understand that acronym, you almost feel like we should just go deep dive in the palm so we can achieve that budgetary Yahtzee of all the aspects of how this actually engages through appropriators. Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, it's a very optimistic view. It's at least from my perspective, that urgent needs are being addressed. Systems are in place, both within established structures, but also with faster moving, challenging, newer innovations for systemic introduction of capabilities. It gives me great hope. And maybe it's just, of the three gentlemen on the line right now, I'm the one with the least amount of naval experience. Maybe that's the difference. I was only active for 5 years. So part of me was like, oh, I don't know if that's going to ever work. But for those that actually saw more of it, like you gentlemen, you're like, yeah, actually, there's a way to do that. I just didn't raise that rank of observation. That's the piece I'm missing from my experience of being able to move at that speed of need.
Ian, I would just add the relationship between the services and industry is critically important. And what I saw during my last tour in the Pentagon is my counterparts, the other 2 stars that were in charge of aviation, submarines, amphibious ships, is a willingness to engage with industry and just have a dialogue like we are now to say, look, here's my problem. This is a significant capability gap. I need to get after it. What can you do for me? What do you have? And that's a very healthy relationship. And then the response I've seen from industry is very positive as well. Willing to make their own investments to get after these capabilities and help out the services. That's what's going to win the day.
Admiral, in your experience there, I'm going to kind of hopefully challenge you a little bit. The construct that you've just described is somewhat transactional, where the conversation may start with industry engagement, but really reliant on that Pentagon staffer to provide what the requirement is. And what we run into often is we know what the challenge is. We don't really know what is out there that we could write a requirement against. And would you have any advice for industry people in the audience on how to shape that conversation? Basically, we think there's a there. We want to give you what you think your solution is in a way that isn't reliant on some staffer doing work and trying to write a perfect requirement that is sometimes obsolete 60 days later because technology has changed.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of curious on how you would advise industry to lead into that conversation.
Yeah, Ed, that's a great point, and it's one we struggled with as we discussed how this parallel process would work, because the requirements process is hidebound and it moves at a glacial pace, right? So there's an opportunity to write what we would call top level requirements, not formal, but okay, I have a capability gap. If I was going to fill that gap, I would want a system that could do A, B, and C. Those are top level requirements. And then the other thing that I've seen that makes industry successful, or we set up industry for success, is when you talk to the three-legged bar stool, or the triad, as I call it, of a program. So, for surface warfare, that's N96, who writes the requirements and who finds the resources. Then if it's a weapon system, it's going to be Program Executive Office Integrated Warfare Systems, Tom Dickerson. And then the fleet, the SWO boss, Surface Warfare Officer boss, Vice Admiral Brendan McLean, who was out here in San Diego. When you have alignment between those three entities, the requirements, the program office that's going to field it, and the fleet that's going to use it, and you have momentum with all three, then you have success.
Thanks for that, Admiral. And let me shift a little bit back to that staffer, having been one, not as long as you, but and having, junior officers report to the Pentagon calling for advice later on. And I think I mentioned this to Ian at one point. There were some people, back to your sort of antibodies, naysayers on an emerging technology that you as the leader may want to explore. Some of our JOs in the Pentagon are hearing, hey, don't let your program die. Don't do anything dynamic. Don't blow it up. Don't lean too far forward. How do you help them, the real believers, the people that are willing to take risks and write requirements in a way that, fulfill a future need, maybe not the risk averse naysayers that kind of want to sit where they are? What's your advice to those JOs that are sitting in those cubicles in the N96 staff today?
Yeah, so as someone who served as an 05 in N96, I was the budget officer, but at the end of the day, my goal was to get as much money for N96 for surface warfare as possible. And that was the metric for success. As the director, I wanted to make sure, given the roughly $30 billion a year that I had to work with, that those resources were going to the right capabilities, that we were properly balanced. So how we got after that is we made sure that, one, we had a fleet input from Admiral Paparo, now Admiral Kaler, and Admiral McLean, that we were mindful of what the fleet needed, and they have priorities lists that they provide. Then we had the CNO's guidance, right? And the CNO's nav plan provides guidance. And then we look at our long-range development plan. I mean, surface warfare has a plan for what future ships are going to be look like. The destroyer after the Arleigh Burke class destroyer is DDGX. So you take a look at what your future looks like, what your current requirements are, and then you have a prioritized list. And that list is based on what capabilities you need to get after first. And if it happens that that young JO's program that has been there forever is no longer a critical capability, then you bring them alongside and say, shipmate, we're going to take some risk in your area because this is much more important today. And that's a tough conversation. It's very challenging when you do need to make those changes, because changes are, especially in an organization as big as OPNAV and the Pentagon.
Well, let's talk more about that future. So where do you see those systems and technologies going? You explained a goal that I think to some extent you had a role in developing for that 60-40 split of manned and unmanned. Will we get there? Will we get there, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? Will it be an end? Do we have to wait for the Pearl Harbor moment before, in that case, now that you mentioned it, we got to get faster on that. When do you think this change will arrive?
If I knew that, I'd probably be a 4-star today in a different place right now. I think we will get there. As a service, the Navy is off compared to an aircraft carrier. We don't throw the rudder over hard. We turn it a few degrees and make changes very deliberately. What I saw in my last 2 years in the Navy is leadership, starting with the CNO, with the Secretary of the Navy, with the entire flag wardroom, is officers that embrace change. One of the initiatives was Get Real, Get Better. And that's basically taking a look at what you're doing, embracing the red if something's not working, making sure you have data to inform your decisions, and then you provide a feedback loop to make sure you're achieving the desired outcome. Sounds obvious, but it's an important culture to foster when we're embracing change. The CNO's guidance on 5 key capabilities. So it's terminal defense, long range fires, counter C5 ISRT, contested logistics, and non-traditional sea denial. Big words, but it's basically how we want to fight and how we want to get after things. Then there are 7 projects, and I won't go into all of them, but it's, we're going to embrace artificial intelligence. We're going to scale unmanned systems. We're going to make sure we can expand our industrial base. We're going to make sure that the shore from which we fight is where it needs to be because it's been neglected. So all that to say, I think we've defined the problem. The first step is, we understand what the issue is. We've defined the problem. The culture of the Navy leadership is all about getting after that problem. The leadership within the Department of Defense is receptive to our value proposition, and Congress is supportive of what we're trying to do. Do we have a lot of issues in shipbuilding? Yes. Again, we've determined what those issues are, and we're taking action. Will we continue to embrace unmanned? I think absolutely. I think we have to get to that future state of 60-40. I think it'll be a decade or more before you start seeing that significant shift. But I think the faster we can move in that direction, the better. The one thing we didn't discuss, or one technology we didn't get into, is a directed energy. This has been a quest for the surface Navy, for the Navy at large, for quite a while, for at least 2 decades. That we fielded a laser on an amphib ship called the Ponce, and we now have a laser deployed on a destroyer that's in the Pacific, but it's moving too slow, and the capability is not where where it needs to be. But boy, if we can figure that out, a bottomless magazine of just shooting stuff out of the air with energy, that is a phenomenal leap in capability. So there's a technology that gets a lot of hype, but we're not moving as quickly as we should. So that's a roundabout way of what I'm thinking about and where I feel the Navy's going in the future.
Yeah.
I thought I would hear USS Ponce and laser in the same sentence. Having been on that platform quite a bit, pretty wild story.
Yeah. But I just feel, well, not only am I a little bit of a SWO, but I'm a SWO nuke. And so like your unlimited energy, this sounds great. You got my attention on this one. I want to talk about this for a whole other podcast and bring other like diagrams to the table. As we round out the conversation here, I think there's 2 more questions I'd like to ask. One is a completely unscripted, very unfair question, and one is a softball, just to put it out there. So I'm going to set expectations before I ask these questions.
Sure.
I had the honor of joining a small conversation with Admiral McCraven earlier, just this week, and I should have prepared for this in advance, but I cannot resist the opportunity to ask this question. And if it becomes a complete train wreck, we'll edit it out of the podcast so no one has to worry about accountability for what we're about to talk about. But I would just be an idiot if I didn't ask this question to you, because it was one of the most interesting things I learned in the past year in the context of national security. It was about the scenario, hypothetical scenario, where, and I'll give real country names, but I think you get the point of the question. Let's say China interdicts one ship on its way to Taiwan, just one. And by interdict, I mean blocks it from moving. As these gentlemen on the line know better than me, a blockade is an act of war, generally legally defined. But does that count as a blockade? How about 2 ships? How about 3? How about under non-uniformed service members? At what point does that become a trigger for the Navy to take a traditional action in response, the American Navy, in response to a blockade? This leader, for those that know the name, I presume, Fred, that you've served with him and know well. I almost wish you could have been on the same panel to argue about this in front of all these people watching and maybe not taking notes in a Chatham House rules. But if he's here openly, and it was an open question, and it was an interesting piece of what would we do as a nation in such a scenario, and what does that mean? Not so much for the technology of directed weapons intervening because of asymmetric capabilities for drones and things like it. That's an old school threat, blockade, or at least something that looks a lot like a blockade. We know. What are your thoughts on that hypothetical scenario? And what do you, if you would either you can take it as a prediction for the future or recommendations for current leadership?
Sure. You mentioned about an unfair question. I always say fair is something you pay to ride the bus. So everything's fair. So with that scenario, I would have several questions in response. First, what ship did they interdict? Was it a commercial vessel? Who was it flagged under? Those details matter. The larger issue is, yep, that's concerning that, this appears to be a blockade, but the details matter anytime it involves ships at sea. This would fall back to a policy decision, right? So what is the current administration's U.S. policy towards Taiwan? And at what point are we going to say, that's a red line, we're not going to allow that, and then we're going to take military action? Just my read on that is I don't see one or even one or two as an issue that would cause us to go to conflict with China. I think that would be something that, again, would be resolved diplomatically. That's just Fred Pyle's opinion. There should be a very high bar before conflict begins. I think that's just a good rule of thumb to make sure that that bar remains high before you start exchanging hardware with one another. I can tell you, for that scenario, if there were a country invading a small island, we have done quite a bit of rehearsal, and that's the primary focus of much of the department as we think about what capabilities we need. As we get into unmanned capabilities that we were discussing, there's a lot of effort going into that scenario and how we would respond.
Brilliant. Well, now, as promised, the softball question. So as we round out here, I feel like I can just talk to these flows for so much longer, but we are, for better or for worse, time constrained in all aspects of life. For those that want to follow more of your leadership and perspectives on this evolving conversation, well, where should our listeners and viewers follow you, sir, to better keep track of your perspectives on all of these national security issues? Are you on the LinkedIns and the Twitters?
I am on LinkedIn. I'm not an active Twitter. I'm an active member of Twitter, but yeah, I am on LinkedIn, and I have my contact on LinkedIn. I'm always available. I enjoy opportunities to have a conversation with both younger uniform members and younger government civilians, just to hear what their thinking is. I stay connected with many that are still in uniform through, if they're going through Naval War College or going through a training event. I try to provide that mentoring at every opportunity I have.
Admiral, I have to ask you a non-softball question. Maybe it is, though. Trying to keep it light. Do you have a leather SWO jacket, and how do you feel about it?
I have a leather SWO jacket, and Ed, I am very proud of that jacket. Yeah, so for the audience, this was, when did the leather jackets come out? Probably 2015-ish. So for the communities here and the culture, aviators have had leather jackets for a long time. There was a period when the surface community was having some significant challenges. If you go back to the Admiral Pyle report, if you Google Vice Admiral Pyle, B-A-I-L-B-I, whatever the spelling is, Phil Pyle, he did a report where some of the actions we had taken over a period of time between the late 90s and 2000s had put the surface community in a position where we didn't want to be, programmatically, capability, et cetera. Fast forward to 2017 and the collisions of two of our ships and loss of sailors. We needed to make some cultural changes and instill some camaraderie, some pride, some esprit de corps back into the community. So the jacket was one piece of that. And it's, when a young sailor qualifies surface warfare, they get that jacket. So it's, welcome to the community. So that's my background, my understanding on the SWO jacket. Do you have one, Ed?
I don't. I do have an aviation jacket. My first unit was an F-14 squadron at Miramar, which is why I was smiling on the goddamn. You're talking about your first tour. Last question from me, movie question. Is Tom Hanks's Greyhound the greatest movie ever made?
It is a fantastic movie. So the movie Ed's referring to is the War of the Atlantic in World War II and our ability to take the Iron Mountain from the continental United States to Europe. And Tom Hanks is a destroyer captain. He's escorting a convoy over to the United Kingdom. And yeah, it's pretty realistic. And what I appreciated in that movie is just the toll of what watchstanding, what combat what the stress of command does to the commanding officer. And Hanks did a phenomenal job on demonstrating that.
My aviation friends call it slow porn. So,
Well, we're definitely going to end the podcast at this point. I don't know why. It's a good way, Ed, for you to try to convince me not to have future co-hosts. But too bad, sir. I'm really glad to have you here. Feel safer whenever we talk Navy stuff and you're by my side. But a special thanks again to Rear Admiral retired Fred Pyle. Thank you so much for the opportunities to have this conversation about a wide range of topics we've covered. Lessons and advice for those currently in service within the Pentagon, commanders, movie references, and maybe even a little bit about how national security can modernize to strengthen American national security. So thank you so much again. And with that, we'll close out this episode and encourage folks to continue chiming in for the next great installment. We'll see if we can, pressure test Ed into leading the next round. That's it. Thank you all so very much.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Ed.
thanks, Admiral.